Good morning and welcome to today's Wyoming Community Navigator Program webinar. We're so glad to have you all join us today. My name is Mandy Bailey and I'm the Advising and Education Director here with the Wyoming Community Navigator Program. I'm going to be your facilitator today, working behind the scenes, assisting as best as I can with any technical issues that may arise, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed we don't have any. You may want to monitor the chat also. We're going to be uploading some documents and some helpful links in there, so make sure you're monitoring the chat throughout the discussion today. The Wyoming Community Navigator Program is funded through the U.S. Small Business Administration and utilizes the Wyoming Entrepreneurial Support Network to reduce barriers that all small businesses often face, including those owned by women, veterans, and those from rural communities and communities of color. The Wyoming Community Navigator uses a hub and spoke model to pursue its goals. Through their collective efforts, the hub and spoke provide training, mentorship, access to capital, and access to other resources to help business owners build resiliency and ultimately be the driving force behind Wyoming's economic recovery. Today's presentation, Getting Started with Open Source Software, is presented by both Bridget Manley and Daniel Patterson. Bridget is an e-learning specialist with a passion for helping learners become effective agents in their careers and their communities. She co-founded Ascendant Design and Training with her husband, Daniel Patterson, in July of 2020. Before that, she was the curriculum manager for a Denver-based startup company where she developed compliance and manufacturing training for the state legal cannabis industry. And Daniel Patterson is a software systems developer with over 30 years of multidisciplinary experience in software, electronic, and mechanical design. He's been involved in several different industries, including logistics, gaming, music, and heavy equipment, to name a few. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to both Bridget and Daniel.
All right, well, thank you, Mandy. We appreciate that wonderful introduction. I'm going to go ahead and gonna share my screen real quick so you can see our deck today. Okay, you should be able to see our slides. The title slide is Getting Started with Open Source Software. So thanks again for being with us today. We're excited to share what we've learned about using open source software to build a business using affordable and credible software tools. So we have found in our own business that finding reliable software doesn't have to be an expensive proposition. Basically you can use open source tools and they're an ideal way to launch or grow your business on a budget. And just a little bit more about us. I'm Bridget Manley. I'm Vice President and Chief Learning Officer of Ascendant Design and Training. Like most small business owners, Daniel and I both wear a lot of hats. Mine include being a learning experience designer, working primarily with companies to help them develop, employee training to help, to help employees do their jobs better. I'm also an adult learning consultant, so I draw on my background in teaching, journalism, and instructional design to help our clients create effective learning experience for adults. I'll be kind of running the presentation today, and then Daniel Patterson, who's also a vice president and our chief technical officer, will be chiming in during the end to answer questions or throughout if we have questions where his expertise might be a better fit. Daniel is, of course, our resident software expert. He's a software systems developer, and he's also kind of our head of product development. So he's working on the other side of the house, developing software tools for people like myself, instructional designers, that we can use to create more effective learning experiences. So let's talk a little bit about what we'll do today, kind of what success in this webinar looks today. So in this interactive session, you'll be able to define what open source software is, and you'll be able to weigh some of the pros and cons of using it for your business. We'll have a pre-recorded session that shows you how to find, vet, download, and use an open source tool. And throughout, we really encourage you to be interactive, to interact both with us and other attendees. And there are multiple ways for you to do that. You can just drop your thoughts or questions into the chat, and we'll pause throughout the presentation to address those. So if you have questions or thoughts you'd like to share, feel free to use that function. If you go into the bottom of your Zoom platform, there should be like a bar of options, one of those being reactions. If you click on that, there'll be a pop-up menu, and one of those options will be to raise hand. So if you have a question, feel free to use that option, and we can come to you as well to see what question you have. As we're pausing throughout the presentation to address chat questions, go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question verbally. We just ask that you leave your mic muted when you're not speaking, just to cut down on any background noise. So with that, we're going to go ahead and dive right in with a discussion question. We'd like to know what you hope to learn today. Maybe you're here because you've heard of open source software, but you're not really sure what it is. Maybe you've tried using open source and you'd like maybe some more tips or guides on how to use it. Or maybe it's something else. Feel free to share your thoughts either in the chat or by unmuting or by using the raise hand function. If you feel comfortable with that, just tell us what you hope to learn today. I'm going to open the chat here so I can see that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so if you want to think on that, that's totally fine. I'll stop throughout and come back to that. Oh, okay. Trey says, would like to see resources available. And as a public bookkeeper, I look forward to seeing what is available for clients. Excellent. Yes, I think we should be able to have some good resources for you today. Cool. Lauren says, I'm hoping to learn the different options for open source software and how to search for open source software. Excellent. Yes, we will cover that today. We'll also have a couple of handouts that will give you some reputable sources you can start with and some actual software tools you can download. But yes, we will cover that in depth today. Excellent. Okay, let's see. Cindy says, I want to get away from QB, I'm assuming QuickBooks, $30 per month charge and looking for some alternatives. Perfect. Yes, we will actually have a walkthrough that will focus on an accounting open software tool that is an alternative to QuickBooks. So this should be pretty helpful for you. Adam says, I hope to find some tools that will help me get my new business organized, especially when it comes to client relationship management. Excellent. Good. Dan might have some further recommendations maybe at the end for some tools that might fit with that. Cool. Okay, so just to save on time, I'm going to keep going, but if you have any other thoughts, we'll come back to those in just a second. Okay, so we're just going to start by just doing a brief description of what open source software is. As the name implies, it is software where the source code is available to everyone. So if you want to know how it's built, you can actually peel it open and see the HTML, and everything is in there. Open source software is often regarded to be safer than commercially published software, and two reasons for that. The first being because it is open source, all code is available for public review. So it's much harder to sneak in something malicious like spyware or malware or something because it is open to everyone. Only verified updates can be checked into open source libraries. Again, so it means that the source the source code has to be verified by an independent third-party source to ensure that it is safe for your computer. It's also a great tool for bootstrapping your business. If you were with us last week in our webinar about different business classifications, we talked a little bit about bootstrapping, and that just means that you're starting your business with the resources you personally have rather than going out and seeking investment. Because a lot of open source software is free or lower cost, it's a great way to get your business started without investing a ton of money into software solutions. Now, that being said, it's important to distinguish between open source and free software. They're sometimes, seen as the same thing, but they can be different. For instance, you might have instances where you can only get the code to an open source tool if you chill out for the paid version. So in this case, it's open source, but it's not free. That being said, most working or compiled versions of open source code are often made freely available to the public without having to buy some sort of premium subscription. But just keep in mind that there are instances where it is open source, but you need to pay for that open source documentation. On the other side of the coin, you might have an instance where it's free, but it's not open source, meaning that the code is not available for you to use and there's, nobody else has looked through it either. So in these instances, you want to exercise discretion. If you find software that is free, but it's not open source, just make sure, kind of do a gut check and see if you trust that source enough to download it. Sometimes free is worth the price, right? Or sometimes it can actually be dangerous. So just, again, do a gut check, check your sources, and we'll go over a little bit about that today, about how you can do that. But just make sure that you are comfortable with that source before you download it if it's not open source. Okay, so I'm just gonna check our chat here real quick. Okay, any thoughts or questions so far? Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute if you'd like. Okay, we'll just keep right on going. So we're gonna, in this next section, we'll talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of using open source. So comparing open source software to commercial alternatives. Just like anything else, open source does have pros and cons. Probably one of the most notable cons for using open source is that it's usually not as slick or well built out as, say, a commercial alternative. But at the end of the day, the real litmus test for any software is not necessarily how it looks or behaves, but whether or not it actually helps you do the thing you're trying to do. And the good news is open source typically will help you achieve those same objectives as you would with a commercially available piece of software. So we're going to, again, look at the pros and cons, and we'll start with the cons, start with the negatives first. One of the main cons of using open source software is that they're rarely signed with trusted third-party certificates. If you've never seen these before, it's basically a software license that the developer gets that when you download that software to your computer, it sends a message to your computer like, hey, we know who built this, they're legit, it's fine. If you don't have this certificate attached to the software, then the computer will automatically be suspicious of it. And it might bring up, basically a dialog box that says, hey, are you sure you want to download this? Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not reputable. It just means that the developer didn't go through the process of getting that third-party certificate. So that is something to keep in mind. The second kind of con with open source is that if you go to the download page from the developer themselves, you'll often see a lot of ads on the page. And a lot of the ads try to get you to download other pieces of software. So if you go to, say again, like a website where you would download open source, you might see downloads for Microsoft 10 and 11 in small print. And then below you'd see a big green button that says download now. That big green button could be an ad, and it could be taking you to download something that is not what you want and may not actually be open source. So unfortunately, this continues to be an issue just because a lot of open source developers try to use ads to make money off their products because they're not charging for the software itself. So that's something to keep in mind. When you go to that page to download, just exercise discretion in making sure you're actually downloading the software. The third kind of con with this is that when you do open source software, there's rarely any kind of dedicated customer support. And this is simply because a lot of open source projects are passion projects. They might be funded through donations or Patreon subscriptions or just free in general. But typically the developers don't have the resources to provide dedicated customer support like you'd get with like QuickBooks or Adobe or any other kind of big commercial software developer. Now, that being said, if you do run across a problem, you can report that problem or report that bug in a forum. And then from there, the developer can go through and actually start addressing that problem. Or there might be other people, other users on the forum who can help you walk you through a problem that you're having. But just keep in mind that there's no real dedicated support with most open source software. Some cases there are, but those might be a subscription based. So keep that in mind as well. Kind of related to that, because a lot of open source developers are doing this kind of on their free time or as a side project, you might go long periods between versions. So again, just keep that in mind. Sometimes it may take a while for new features to come into open source tools for that reason. Worst case scenario, you might have instances where the projects are abandoned just in instances where the projects are abandoned altogether. And that's usually because the developer didn't have enough monetary support or enough time. So they might decide that they're just going to stop developing altogether. And if this happens, then unfortunately, you're in the position where you have to find and adopt another software package to meet the need that you're trying to fill. So all that aside, there are still some pretty strong advantages to using open source software. The main one would be that open source applications are typically fairly easy to find and use. Unless you're working for some sort of specialized or government regulated purpose, you can start and operate your business with open source software with hardly any software fees. Another nice thing about open source is that they rarely lock you into any kind of proprietary file format. So let me give you an example of what that would be. Say you're developing like a picture in Adobe Illustrator, and you want to save the file where you actually edit that image. That'll save as .ai, which of course stands for Adobe Illustrator, but you can't open that file in any other program except Adobe Illustrator. Commercial developers sometimes use this as a way to keep you locked in to that particular software tool, so it makes it very hard to migrate out. By contrast, open source tools typically have very open file formats. That way you can, build something in one tool and you can open it in multiple other tools, including some commercially available ones. So it's a lot more versatile that way. Similarly, open source typically doesn't lock you into any kind of strict workflow. Sometimes with commercially available tools, they'll try to get you to do it this one way because this is the way we think you should do it. Open source is a lot more flexible. You can find different workflows that work for you. It doesn't, again, lock you into doing it one specific way. So you can experiment and see what works for you and your business. As we mentioned before, open source tools are tested independently by third parties. So you know that it's safe. It's been looked at by multiple eyes. And because it is open source, there's usually a lot more community involvement. People who are really into open source will oftentimes be very active on the forums. They're often very very eager to get other people to adopt it as well, so they can answer your questions. Sometimes they're actually volunteering to the platform itself, and we'll look at that in just a moment. But first, I see in the chat we have a question from Jesse about which certificates are necessary. Daniel wrote back, the certificate is an additional piece of code the developer requires to become somewhat trusted by the target system. That certificate is referred to as a code signing certificate. Yeah, so it's something that the developer has to apply for. Again, it just says your computer, hey, this is safe, this is legit. So thanks for answering that, Dan. Okay, so let's talk briefly about supporting open source. Basically it's understood that if you find a particular tool that you really like and it's helping you in your business, it's good practice to give back to that tool in some way. And fortunately, there are multiple ways you can do that. If there's a premium version of the software available, you can just buy the premium version. You'll get more value out of it. There'll probably be more tools, and it helps the developer. Similarly, you might be able to buy a service plan. Again, you get value out of this and the fact that you get priority service when you have a problem, but it also, again, supports the developer and makes sure that they can continue working on this project. You can also just donate money outright. A lot of times when you go to download a piece of open source software, there'll be a like a PayPal link or some other kind of link where you can just donate to the project. I believe that some open source projects are supported through Patreon as well. If you're familiar with that, basically it's, you're kind of like a fan club and you donate a certain amount a month. And usually they give you some sort of value add with that as well. You can also thinking about volunteering if you have some specific skills that might be valuable to the project. For instance, a lot of open source tools always need what they call beta testers, or people who are willing to try a new version of the product that's not quite ready for prime time, but it's pretty close. And they need people to go through and say, hey, I found this problem, or hey, can you add this feature? That'd be cool. That's really important for developers. It gives them the feedback they need to make sure that the software is meeting their users' needs. If you're really good at technical writing, or even if you know multiple languages, you can volunteer by writing user documentation or translating existing documentation into another language. And if you're really a whiz with HTML and you know how to do some development, you can actually volunteer by working on the project itself. So it looks like we have another, okay, just another thing in the chat. Jesse said thank you, so I'm hoping that was helpful. I'm going to pause and see if you have any other thoughts or questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute if you'd like. Okay. Okay, well, let's go ahead and head to the next section here. In this next section, we're going to walk you through how to choose the right software for you. And this is a 5-step process, pretty simple and straightforward, but we'll go through each of the 5 steps individually. The process starts with identifying what your specific need is. Then it goes into finding the application, downloading and installing it, taking a walkthrough, kind of getting familiar with how it works, and then learning how to use it. So we're going to have some documents that will have actually some information on where you can download well-known open source tools. We have 2 formats. One is like a PDF kind of Word document. The other one is also a PDF, but it's set up as a table. It's the same information. It's just put in 2 different formats. So if Mandy, if you would mind dropping that in the chat, that would be wonderful. Thank you. That'll be helpful for the next section here. Okay, so let's start with step 1, specifying what you need. When you're looking at software, it's really easy to look at something and say, "Ooh, that looks cool. I want to play with that," without stopping to think, how is this actually going to help my business? So before you even start looking at any type of software, it's good just to sit down and clarify for yourself, what is it that I need to do? What do I need to get done day to day? So for example, maybe you're a new company and you're scaling and you've got a lot of new employees doing some kind of technical or complex processes. Maybe you need to produce training videos for new employees and you want to do it without having to spend a ton of time learning a complex tool or getting an associate's degree in video design. So you need just a quick, easy tool to help you create and edit videos. Maybe, as mentioned before, maybe you need some way to track your income and expenses, or maybe you want to find a more affordable option for tracking your accounting. That's a need too. What other needs might you have in your business right now that maybe can be met with some kind of software tool? If you're comfortable with that, go ahead and drop that in the chat, or again, feel free to unmute if you'd like. What other needs might you have in your business? While you're thinking on that, I'll give you an example from our business. We've been doing more projects with clients that require software training. So I've had to find a way to quickly and easily record my screen so I can demonstrate how to do different processes. I found a really good tool called OBS Studio. It's a free open source screen recording or recording tool that works really well for screen recording. It's actually used by gamers. people who, like to, play video games and then broadcast that. I've noticed that there's lots of pretty decent open software out there for people who are gamers, but can also translate to a business setting as well. So Trey responded, track employee hours worked and payroll. Excellent. Yeah, that's always a big thing, especially when you're managing employees. Yeah. Dan, I can't remember. Do we have any resources on our handout that would address that?
Well, actually, yeah, our new cache.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Example.
Sorry.
No, I should be audible. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Dan.
The new cache example does have some support for employee hour tracking and payroll. It's not really complex, so it would probably only perform well in the small business environment. But yeah, there are several other examples out there of things that can actually perform pretty complex management tasks for just about any size of business.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. Okay. Jesse Williams wrote in, create a platform to facilitate interactions and communications among clients. That's interesting. Yeah. Daniel, can you think of any solutions for that one too?
I can't remember the name of it, but there is a independent solution similar to Slack, and I'll look that up here in the next couple of minutes.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, that'd be really helpful. Yeah, because I know Slack is a big one right now that's used, but that one's on a freemium. You get, I think, 10,000 messages and then you have to pay for it. So yeah, I'm sure that there are some open source solutions to that as well. Okay, while Dan is looking that up, I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next step here. Once you've specified what your need is, the next step is to find the application that's going to fit that need. And for this, we recommend kind of a multi-layered approach where you start with one source and then go down to other sources until you find what you're looking for. And this particular approach starts with the most reputable, trusted sources and then goes down to ones that might have a little bit more risks. You're always starting with the resources that carry least risk, so you can make sure that you're finding a good tool. So the first one on that list would be using well-known software lists compiled by a reputable source. So instead of just hopping onto Google and typing in some sort of search term, you want to instead start with any list you might already have of trusted open source lists or hubs. So again, in the chat, we have lists of trusted open source software in 2 formats that you can download. It's also a good idea as you start experimenting and trying different open source to keep your own lists as well. So you can remember which publishers you really like and which ones are reputable. So if you can't find what you're looking for in some sort of well-known software list, the next place to try is to search in well-known open source hubs. And a hub is kind of like what it sounds like. It's a central repository where you can find and download different types of open source software. 2 of the most well-known ones and 2 really good ones are included in the handout. They're GitHub, which has recently been acquired by Microsoft, I believe. And then the other one is called SourceForge. Those are both really good open source software hubs. When you get into a hub like that, you could run across millions of titles. So it can be kind of overwhelming if you're just kind of browsing. But they do include pretty powerful search functions where you can just type in, say the name of the software if you know it, or you can type in a function of what you're trying to do, and it'll help you find software tools that will help you accomplish that. So if you can't find what you're looking for in a hub, the next place to look is, trying to find articles from well-known publications. These might be trade journals, magazines, periodical publications, anything that's published by a reputable source. These typically have reviews of new or updated software, including open source software. And as often as possible, see if you can find links directly to that software in those articles and access the source from that link. Because that way you'll know that that source has been verified, that link is good, and you can go straight to that software tool. So if you can't find what you're looking for in any of those first 3 tiers, the last resort is to just hop on, Google or Bing and just do a search in the wild, as it were. Now, this is where you want to exercise a fair amount of discretion because you might run across publishers or tools that may not be reputable, could actually be, somewhat dangerous. So just, again, lean towards sources that you already know is legitimate or are linked to sources you already trust. Now, as with using any software, really, you have to kind of, gauge your own tolerance for a certain amount of risk. Just searching for open source tools on the internet, that carries a fair amount of risk. So you want to make sure, that you're comfortable with that. If you ever are misled by a source, say that they, say this tool will do this and it doesn't work at all, just don't go back to that source in the future. Blacklist them, pretty much. If a source ever cheats you in any way, make sure you report that to authorities as well. And again, if you're using those first 3 tiers of either using software lists, hubs, or publications, that will rarely be an issue.
Bridget, it looks like we actually have a question regarding those, and I think Daniel might have just answered it.
Okay, yeah, excellent, yeah. 2 known hubs, yeah, GitHub and SourceForge. Perfect, thank you, Daniel. Okay, I'm just going through the chat here and seeing what we have so far. Lauren Carlson, in response to Jesse's question on a platform to facilitate interactions and communications, Lauren recommended Discord, and it's free again for gamers. So I'm not sure how professional it is. Yeah, I've heard of Discord too. I've actually noticed some, I've noticed more professionals are using it as well. So that's a good recommendation. Cody says, I'm looking for assistance with Arduino IDE, trying to get some libraries to work. Okay, that sounds like a question maybe Dan might be able to help you with. So yeah, Dan, if you know of any sources or anything, feel free to drop that in when you have a moment. That would be perfect. We got the names to the 2 hubs. Okay, perfect. Excellent. Yeah, thanks for dropping in your questions and thoughts. This really makes it valuable, I think, for everybody. It's nice to have a discussion rather than just lecturing at people for 40 minutes. So thanks for participating today. Okay, so the third step is after you've found a piece of software you think is going to work for you is to download and install it. Of course, the first thing you want to do is verify that the source is safe. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, just a little bit of housekeeping. When you find that source, if you go to their homepage, you'll want to select the version of the software that matches your operating system. So on the slide here, I have a screenshot of the homepage for OBS Studio. It's that screen recording tool I mentioned earlier. And the 3 options for Windows, Mac, and Linux are highlighted. That's where you would click to download the software for each of those operating systems. Now, once you've downloaded the setup file, you can typically run it directly from your browser. So it's pretty easy to set up. Now, again, if the developer didn't get that publicly trusted third-party certificate, you might see a dialog on your computer like that's on the slide. This is from Microsoft Windows. It's a dialog box. The top is yellow, and it says, do you want to allow this app from an unknown publisher to make changes to your device? You'll see something like this or similar when you download a piece of software that does not have that third-party certificate. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's, malware or that it's unsafe, but this is where you want to do a gut check and make sure, am I really confident of, am I confident with this source? Did I get it from a reputable source? Did it come from GitHub or SourceForge or something like that? If so, you're probably fine. But if it's something you found off the internet, this might be something where you really want to, really check and make sure that you're good with it before you proceed. Okay, so the fourth step, once you've downloaded, once you download it and you feel good about it, the next step is to just kind of get in there and kind of play with it a little bit, see what it does. You want to explore, the software's user interface features as well as its key features. So user interface is a fancy word for what does it look like and how do you interact with it. So you want to explore the main options and toolbars, see what's available in there, see what you can do. Also explore the key features, particularly the ones that you think you'll be using right away. And just generally get a feel for how it works. One of the best ways to do this is simply just open a new file of some kind of poke around, play around with it. And then when you're done, close it without saving, like you've lost nothing, but you've still had a chance to kind of tinker with it and see what it does. Let's see. Okay. So with that, we'll go to step 5, which is oftentimes the hardest part of learning new software or using new software, is learning how to use it. Kind of the key for this is to both use and create documentation that will help you use it in the future. So documentation, what do we mean? Well, this can be something like a help guide or tutorials or other sorts of user-facing tools that the developer creates. And these are usually available on the software's homepage. If you go into the software tool itself, most of the time there'll be, say like a menu option in the main menu for help. And if you go there, you might find a help guide or a link to video tutorials or maybe the forum. Any of those things can be really good tools when you're learning how to use a new piece of software. Another good source too is YouTube. I know that I myself personally, when I use open source, 9 times out of 10, I go on YouTube, I can find a few videos right away. And within 5 to 10 minutes, I can do that one thing that I need to do to get unstuck and keep moving with my process. So there's lots of really good, tutorials available on YouTube for open source tools. And one thing to keep in mind that when you're learning any kind of new tool, including open source, you want to do a good job of documenting your own procedures. So that way, when you've learned, for instance, how to do a particular thing in a tool, and you come back 6 months later and you're like, I got nothing, I don't remember anything. Documentation will help you with this. So it can be something as simple as taking a few notes, say like in your OneNote or in a Word document somewhere, or just someplace where it's easy to find. So that way later you can remember how you did that one thing that was so important. This is also really good practice if you're planning to scale your business at any time and you're planning to bring on employees who will do some of the tasks that you're doing right now. If you have documentation, very clear step-by-step guides for how to do different tasks in your open source software, it'll be very easy to hand that off to your, hand that off to your new employees, walk them through those steps. And then at that point, that documentation becomes a job aid for them so they can do that process in the future. Okay, so I'm gonna just check the chat. Okay. So it looks like Daniel and Cody are, figuring out the Arduino experience. Are there any other questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, either in the chat or again by unmuting and just asking out loud? Okay, so in this next slide, we're going to take you through a pre-recorded demo of how you can find, vet, and download an open source tool. This tool is called NewCash, and this is an alternative to QuickBooks. This is an open source accounting tool. So I'm going to launch to that. I'm going to start playing it. If you can't hear the audio, please let me know. Just go ahead and write that in the chat and we will get it fixed, but you should be able to hear the voiceover.
Today, we decided that we needed business accounting software, so we're going to download and install NewCash. Let's get started. First, I'll open our well-known applications handout and find the name about halfway down the page. Then click on the link in the download column. On the NewCash web page, notice that the software supports Linux, Windows, and Macintosh. We're using Windows today, so I'll click the link for 8, 10, and 11. At that time, we're redirected to the new cache page at SourceForge. Notice that they'll make you wait for a few seconds before the download starts. Once the file is downloading, it may take up to several minutes to complete, depending upon your internet connection and how busy the SourceForge website is at the time. Unfortunately, since the new cache group don't sign their setup as a trusted application, Windows will warn you about running an application from an unknown publisher. Since we know where the software came from today, I'll click Yes to run the application. New cache is available in a number of different languages. Today we're going to stick with English. Click OK to continue. Make sure to read the software license agreement and agree with the terms. Then click Next. The default destination location will be perfect for most cases. Click Next. Today we'll pick the full installation. Click Next. The name of the Start menu folder will be New Cache by default. Click Next. In the Additional Tasks page, leave the options checked to create a desktop icon and to create a Start menu link. Click Next. The Review page details all of the settings for the current installation. Click Install. It may take several minutes for the files to be copied and configured. The Information page offers a brief description of new cache, some of the options available for support, and a short list of built-in features. Click Next. After setup is completed, click the Finish button. In the Windows search text box, type as many of the letters GNUCASH that are needed to display the new cache app in the matches list. Once you see a match, press Enter to run it. When new cache opens, a Tip of the Day dialog box is displayed containing a helpful recommendation for becoming more productive in your daily workflow. In the Welcome to New Cache dialog, you have a choice to create a new set of accounts, import Quicken files, otherwise known as QIF files, or to open the new user tutorial. Today, let's just
Did it stop playing? I think it did.
Yeah,
It
I think
did,
it
yeah.
stopped.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Just open the tutorial and click there we go. OK. We'll get a glimpse of the built-in help file. It might look like a lot of information at first, but if you take your time and read through it, you'll not only become very skilled at using new cache, you'll understand a lot of basic accounting concepts that can promote organization and lead to a clear understanding of the health of your business.
Okay, so there's just a really quick and fast kind of guide to what we've talked about so far today and how to find and vet open source tools. Do you have any questions or thoughts before we move on to kind of our wrap up piece? Okay, we'll go ahead and
Today, we
oops.
decided that we need
Okay, let me figure out how to get past this slide. Okay, there we go. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, to kind of put a bow on it today. Just remember that many aspects of starting and running a business can be handled using open source software that is free to use. And remember, open source software is available to everyone. So it's not locked behind a paywall. It's not locked behind, some sort of corporate gate. It's available for everyone to use. As we mentioned before, you can use it to run many aspects of your business. Self-paced training is usually very easy to find, whether it's provided by the developer themselves in their help files or on the download page, or whether it's on YouTube. There are lots of resources you can use to get yourself trained up on any kind of open source software that you get. Just always remember when you're using any sort of help guide, just to verify while you're using it. And an easy way to do this, for instance, is while you're watching a YouTube video about a tool, just follow along with the steps and make sure you can do everything that the presenter tells you. 9 times out of 10, they're great. They, people who are, developing these particular videos have been in the tool for a while. But just remember, there are a few that aren't so hot. So, just keep that in mind and make sure you verify all the information before you start applying it in your business. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and open it up to any questions you might have. Looks like we have, okay. It looks like Cody Gray, it looks like you got your questions answered, it looks like. Okay. Okay, let's see. Josh asks, is there any open source ERP or enterprise resource planning systems that you would recommend?
Okay, there is one that I've heard of, and I haven't installed it, so I can't provide any kind of yes or no, up or down recommendation on it. But the letters of it are ODOO. And it's supposed to be a pretty significant open source CRM software with enterprise capabilities.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, maybe putting that in the chat, that would be great. Okay, all right. Excellent. Jess says, just brought it up. Thanks so much. Perfect. Any other questions? Okay, Jesse Williams asks, how can the open source software be used to create apps for businesses? I'll hand that over to Daniel. He'll know more than I do.
Okay. Well, there are a number of different tools that each specialize in, like different functionality, anywhere from text editors, clear out to language compilers, to, visual editors, graphics editors, movie editors. And a lot of those things are just kind of like obtained through a mix and match sort of strategy. And for each particular aspect of developing whatever app you're going to develop, whether it happens to be for Android or for PCs or for Linux or Mac, you'll basically acquire these particular specialized tools to do one or two different functions, and then you form a workflow through this chain of tools that you've acquired, and then basically follow that same workflow over and over again as you compile your apps and maintain them and improve them over time.
So just to make sure that I understand that, Daniel, it's kind of like, for lack of better words, it's almost like Lego development, where you can take a little bit from here and a little bit from here, and you can build kind of your own thing, right?
Yeah, and a lot of people have very specific preferences as to what they want and what they don't want, and there are going to be two tools out there, one for each type of preference, and so maybe something that you would use to edit your text might not be my cup of tea, but the main outcome of us both using these open source text editors of two different kinds even is that we end up having a text file that's commonly shared between us most of the time. And that works with a number of the other file formats as well, whether you're editing a picture or a movie or even financial data. 9 times out of 10, the open source applications that you've selected will support the most standard versions of those different types of files. so that at the end of the day, it didn't really even matter what kind of software that you had selected to edit that information. You'll be able to share that information with other people that use completely different tools for editing their version of that information.
Excellent. Excellent. Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, Trey has a question. He says, suppose a business starts with open source software and decides to transfer to QBO. Is there a way to import the information from OSS to QBO? I'm assuming QBO means like commercial, like software. Does that sound right, Dan? Oh, QuickBooks Online. Okay, thank you. Okay. Okay, so yeah, so you start with open source and you decide you want to transfer to QuickBooks Online. Is there a way to import the information from OSS to QBO?
Very limited.
Okay.
Unless they've changed it. My information on QuickBooks Online is now a little bit dated. The last time I saw anything about QuickBooks Online was probably, I don't know, 3 years ago. So take that with a grain of salt. But I can tell you as of that moment, you can import very little information and you can export very little information, and every other thing is stuck in QuickBooks. And actually, I've always taken that as a reason to avoid QuickBooks altogether, is that they use the proprietary systems and proprietary formats to lock you into their system. And once you're in, you can hardly ever escape unless you're willing to do a lot of manual data entry to basically recreate your books outside of QuickBooks. So.
And I'm assuming that that's probably the same way with a lot of commercially available tools, where if you're starting an open source, it might be difficult to get those records or that, files into that commercial tool, simply because it is designed to keep you locked in. And by extension, it also locks other people out. Would that be fair to say?
Other than doing it manually, and, which I've been a part of before. I've been parts of projects before where everybody on the team had to get together and manually enter all of the accounting information of a company into a QuickBooks system, for example. And it takes, for a company that has history, it can take several days to manually enter all of your information, but that's the only way to get it in there. And like you said, that's the only way to get it back out too. And that really kind of goes across the entire industry. Every time you see this large commercial infrastructure of some sort, whether it's Adobe or possibly even, Microsoft has been guilty of that from time to time, even though they have a tendency to share. But anytime you see very large software, 9 times out of 10, all of the formats are completely proprietary or secret, to that company. And they don't want you basically leaving their product once you're in the product. So.
Right. And that's something to keep in mind. I mean, again, like every business is different, your, tolerance for risk and stuff is different. So yeah, I mean, certainly, it's one of those instances where your mileage may vary and you just kind of want to pick, what's right for you. But yeah, I mean, that is something to keep in mind too, as well. Any other thoughts or questions before we wrap up today?
So Bridget and Daniel, it almost seems also safe to say that when you do get locked in, going back to Cindy, for example, in the beginning with QuickBooks, that also means you get locked into those price increases as they come as well, simply because by nature, you have a hard time getting out and you have to have access to those for your bookkeeping.
Yeah, especially with QuickBooks. I wouldn't necessarily call them aggressive. They're just following a business model, but at the same time, it's very difficult to get away unless you do it manually.
Okay. Yeah. Trey just posted price increase is the largest complaint I'm hearing right now. And I'm assuming that's with QuickBooks specifically. So, okay. Jesse has a question: how to protect data confidentially using open source software?
Well, okay, a lot of the open source software is going to end up being device based, whether it's something you install on your tablet or something you install on your PC. It's going to be, saving the files and data directly on your device. So the important thing in that case would be protecting your device from sharing any of its information beyond your own knowledge, using good security software, good backup, and backing up your data in places where that information is not publicly available. That would be separate from the concept of like saving your information on the cloud, where like for example with QuickBooks Online, for example, all of your financial data is protected in their server, and they're responsible to protect that data at their location.
Right. And I think you could probably even make the argument that is one of the other advantages of using open source, is that it typically is, saving to your computer rather saving the cloud. So you have more control over the data. And, heaven forbid, their cloud goes out, you don't lose all your data, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And then, just to add to that, is that when the internet goes out, typically your open source software doesn't go out. Whereas with QuickBooks Online, you might be sitting there and waiting for an hour or two for the internet to come back on. So yeah, definitely desktop oriented data storage is still definitely a thing. And if you were to sit here with me, you'd know that it's actually a preferable thing. And cloud storage is an important progression for our culture, but doing all of the work that you possibly can do on your desktop is a very productive way to go.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like having a kerosene lamp when the electricity goes out. It may not be the sleekest thing, but when you need it, you really need it. And yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Mandy.
Thank you so much, Bridget and Daniel. This is great information. We really appreciate you guys being here with us today. And thank you to all of you for participating. We really appreciate having a participatory environment. It adds to the conversation and discussion and really helps to get a lot of value out of that. So thank you everyone for participating as well. So we also have a very, I would say brief, it's not that brief, probably 2-minute evaluation that will pop up after this. If you all would please take the evaluation, the survey, it really helps us to develop our webinars and our trainings and services that we provide to you as well. So please look for that. And also check out our Wyoming Community Navigator page for upcoming events. And hopefully we will have Bridget and Daniel back soon for more events. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.